Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Joseph Headley, also known as Joe The Quilter, and his murder in 1826. This story is very different to the normal ones I cover in that this still remains an unsolved murder. So this time there is no punishment for the crime. But I do hope that you will still enjoy it and find it as interesting as I did whilst researching it. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this story, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It is completely free to subscribe to YouTube channels. Thank you. Joseph Headley was born in around 1749 in a little village called Warden, just outside of Hexham, Northumberland, in the northeast of England. His early life is very much a mystery. All that is known is that he originally trained to be a tailor, but this is something that he did not seem to enjoy, and it is said that his work was often not very good. However, he soon found that he had a talent for quilting. All the work was done by hand in those days, and it was tricky, intricate work, but Joseph's talent led him to be highly sought after in not just the area where he lived, but even as far away as America. It also led him to acquire the name of Joe the Quilter, a name which stuck with him for life and beyond. At the age of around 23, Joseph is said to have married a lady by the name of Isabel. Her surname was possibly Thompson. She was by all accounts 25 years older than Joseph. This did not seem to matter to the couple, and they soon moved into a two-room cottage in an area known as Homer's Lane in Warden. In 1826 the area was quite isolated. The photo on screen at the moment shows Homer's Lane today. It is a beautiful place and there are a lot more homes in the area now. But this is just the lane, so obviously you can't see any of the houses. The cottage that the couple lived in went by the name of Homer's House, although there seems to be no reason why the cottage had this name. The cottage was very small, just 2 rooms. Everything they used and needed, such as the bed and the fireplace for cooking, would be in these 2 rooms, and it seems that they only used one as the second was used for storage. Joseph would have also worked on his quilts in this one room. The couple made the cottage their home, with a little garden either side of the building and a few small animals. But sadly, in later years, Joseph's wife became very ill, and Joseph had to look after her every need. This, it would seem, resulted in him being unable to keep up with his quilting work, and money became quite scarce, and he even had to sell some of his household items to pay for their needs. There are no dates in any articles that I have been able to find giving a date of death for Joseph's wife. But by the time she died, Joseph was said to be left in need of parish help to survive. This could have been anything from food to money. Joseph was by now himself a relatively old man, and not as able to get around as he had been before. And it is stated that in the winter of 1823 he may have died, had it not been for the local clergymen wading through very severe snowdrifts to take him food when others had been unable to do so. It would seem that Joseph's later life passed by quietly. He was said to be well liked in the area, and many people would call on him when passing his cottage. And by 1826 Joseph would have been around 76 years old, though some reports suggest he is older, with one even saying that he was 80 years old. On January the 3rd, 1826, Joseph had walked to Walrick Grange, some short distance from his cottage. I had at first thought that this was a large house, but I now believe that it was a farm. And I have recently travelled this distance by car, and I can say that in snow, for a man in his late 70s, it would have been quite a trip there and back. At the farm, Mrs. Colbeck, the farmer's wife, had given him some items such as milk and sugar and a sheep's head. Sheep's heads were quite common as food in those days, though I have to admit it's not something that I would ever have a particular fancy for eating. Joseph had then headed back to his cottage. It was known that around 6 p.m. William Herdman called on Joseph on his way home from Fourstones paper mill, which was quite close by. They sat and talked for a while, and afterwards William would say that Joseph was busy preparing his tea and he was well when he left him. At around 7 p.m, after William had left, a lady by the name of Mrs. Briggs had called at Joseph's cottage, seeking directions to the village of Fourstones, having missed the road in the dark of the night. She was later to say that she believed Joseph to be alone in the cottage at the time she called, and she was the last known person to see him alive. A man by the name of Mr. Smith, who lived at Horton Castle, or that could be Horton Castle, was said to have rode past the cottage at around 8 p.m. that night, and when asked later he said all was quiet and dark, and he does not seem to have thought this to be unusual at the time. Although several people passed the cottage over the next couple of days and noticed it seemed quiet, no one seemed to be too concerned until the 7th of January, when neighbours went to the cottage in search of Joseph. William Herdman had passed at least twice prior to this, and although he had noticed a pair of clogs outside that seemed unusual to him, others had said that Joseph had likely thrown them away, having got a new pair, and perhaps everyone just assumed that Joseph was keeping inside in the warm, away from the cold weather. But I can't help thinking that they surely would have wondered why he had not been out in search of food, but it seems that they had not. When the neighbours went to look for Joseph, they said that outside of the cottage they thought some marks of blood could be seen in the snow, and after finding the door locked and knocking several times with no answer, they finally decided to force the door open. Inside they were met with a scene of chaos. It was said that blood could be seen in various parts of the room. There seemed to be signs of a struggle. It was stated that a clock had been broken, boxes and drawers had been opened and searched, and it was thought that some small silver items may have been stolen. But there was no sign of Joseph. However, on entering the second room of the cottage, where the window was all but completely blocked up with just a small gap at the top, they found the body of Joe the Quilter. It was found that the head, neck and face of Joseph were covered in many cuts. One report suggested as many as 44. His hands were badly cut, thought to be caused as he had tried to fend off his attacker or attackers. There was also a garden hoe and a coal rake with bloody handprints on them, and both were believed to have been used in the dreadful attack. It was felt that there may have been more than one attacker. It was said that Joseph had died of blood loss from the many wounds that he had received in the most brutal attack. Joseph's clothes appeared to have mud on them, and this made those who found him believe that he had possibly managed at some point to make his escape outside of the cottage, but no doubt due to his age and the possibility of two attackers, he had been quickly found and returned to the cottage. Blood was found around the door of the cottage at a height that was believed to be the same as where Joseph's head would have reached had he been standing in the doorway. There were many bloody fingerprints around the inside of the cottage, but of course this was at a time long before any kind of trace of a culprit could be made from his or her fingerprints. It seems that after the attack the cottage door had been locked from the outside and the key had been taken away, as there was no sign of it anywhere in the cottage, and I did not find any evidence of the cottage key ever having been found. Later, a diagram of the cottage was printed in the local papers. This, as you can see on screen now, shows the very basic layout of the cottage and the location where Joseph's clogs were found outside, and also the location of where his body was found. Similar to the story of Archibald Bolam, The story of Joe the Quilter seems to have caught the public eye, and many accounts of the murder were printed, and even some books were written, such as the book published in March of 1826 entitled The Hermit of Warden. Although no author is given, the book was to be sold by M. Barker of Hexham, priced at 3p a copy. And several verses about the life of Joe the Quilter were written by a Mr. A. Wright, and I would have loved to have read it to you, but it is rather long, so I have decided against doing that. There was no trace of the murderer or murderers, and there was little or nothing to go on. No one had seen anything or anyone unusual in the area, and from all the articles I have read, it seems the items that were believed to have been stolen from the cottage never turned up for sale in any of the local areas. Several arrests were made, one of those being William Herdman, who had spent some time with Joseph on the night of January the 3rd, but it was felt that he had not only no motive for the crime, but was not of a mind to do it. This was a way used in the past to describe someone they felt was not capable of thinking of committing the crime of murder. The parish of Warden put up a reward of 100 guineas. This would have been around £100, and was a lot of money in 1826, but even this did not bring anyone forward with any information. And I would imagine this to be because no one had seen anything to tell, and those who had no wish to come forward no matter the amount of money on offer. The reward was not the only thing offered in the hopes of catching those involved. Robert Peel, the then Home Secretary, on behalf of the King, offered a pardon to anyone who came forward with any information, but not to the person who had committed the deed. They would, of course, if caught, be hanged for murder. Still, no one came forward, and the mystery surrounding Joseph's death remained. The police did not give up on the search. In 1828, an unnamed man was arrested in connection with the murder, but just as had been the case previously, he was released without charge. Joseph was buried in the churchyard in Warden on January the 10th, 1826. It is to be assumed that he was buried with his wife. His burial entry clearly states under his name that he was murdered. I did not find a full account of the funeral, but I am sure that we can believe that many of the people of Warden and Four Stones will have attended, and perhaps from further afield, as Joe the Quilter was well known and well liked. I visited the churchyard recently, and it truly is a lovely place. Sadly, I found no sign of any headstone for Joseph, and I doubt very much that he ever had one. The motive for his murder was mostly thought to be money. It was felt that people had mistakenly believed that Joseph, due no doubt to his reputation as a popular quilter, was rich. However, at the time of his death, this could not have been further from the truth, as Joseph was poor and in need of parish relief, as I mentioned earlier. This leads me to believe those to blame were not from the local area, as they would have been well aware that Joseph had no money in his home. In 1836, an unnamed man in Carlisle on his deathbed confessed to the crime, but it seems this was neither proven nor taken seriously. Another man is also said to have confessed while in prison in Gloucester. He was described as an Irish navvy who had been employed in the area at the time building roads, but there is no evidence to suggest that this was ever looked into. Of the two, the Irishman seems the most likely, as he was in the area when Joseph was murdered, but to date the sad and tragic death of Joe the Quilter remains unsolved. In March of 1826, not long after the death of Joe the Quilter, his belongings were put up for sale. He had very little, as you can see from this article published about the sale at the time. Homer's house was finally demolished in 1872. I have found no details of anyone living there after Joseph's death. To pass the area today, there are no signs of the cottage at all. In around 2015, Beamish Museum excavated the site of the cottage using old maps and a postcard that had been printed at the time of the murder to locate the site where the cottage had been. The foundations of the cottage were found along with flagstones, fireplace bricks, buttons and pins. The cottage was later replicated in Beamish Museum grounds, even down to the crack in the outside wall, and it was opened to the public in around 2018. A fitting tribute to the man that people can now see how he lived and hear his story, and I do hope to visit there one day myself. Sadly, however, we will probably never know who killed Joe the Quilter, the quiet, well-liked man of Warden. So what do you think? Do you think this was a case of someone outside the area believing that Joseph had money? Or do you think it may have been someone closer to home? Do you think there was more than one attacker? Joseph put up a mighty fight and is even said to have escaped once, which seems harder to do with two attackers, but of course one could have been keeping watch while the other committed the deed and only took part when they realised that Joseph was tougher than he looked. But I can't help thinking that it might just have been the Irish road builder who was in the right place at the right time. There is apparently a published book which claims to solve the case. I have as yet not read this book, so cannot say what I think, but I might read it soon and come back with a short postscript type video. If anyone would be interested in this, do please let me know. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.